Well, I mentioned Chief Joseph just a little while ago, so let's go ahead and talk about Chief Joseph. One of my students asked if we were going to be discussing Chief Joseph at all in this Tribes of the Great Plains class, since the Nez Perce are not a Plains tribe. And the answer is yes, because the final part of their story takes place in the Northern Plains and involves some of the tribes we've been talking about. All right, well, first of all, Chief Joseph wasn't actually his name. His name, which I'm not going to attempt to say, knowing nothing really about the Nez Perce language, translates into thunder rolling down the mountain. But, you know how Americans are. It's easier just to say Joe. So he was known as Chief Joseph. He was a member of the Nez Perce, which, if pronounced according to the correct French, would be Ne Perce. But Nez Perce is the Americanized, kind of like Iroquois and Iroquois. And just like with Iroquois, it's really irrelevant because that's not their name for themselves anyway. This particular group of people that are known as the Nez Perce or Ne Perce, which is French for the pierced noses, know themselves as the Nimipu, which means the people. Anyhow, Chief Joseph, thunder rolling down the mountain. Sometimes this is something that people get confused about. They think that he was the single leader of that tribe, but like most tribes, they did not have a single leader. He was the leader of a prominent band, and there were several such bands that made up the tribe. There were other band chiefs that were involved in this, along with Joseph, including along with the decision making, including but not limited to two of the more prominent ones that are pictured here, Whitebird and Looking Glass. In 1855, the Nez Perce had signed a treaty with the United States that had ceded a good portion of their traditional lands in Oregon and Washington, but they agreed to a reservation that included a pretty good chunk of what had been their traditional homeland, and that's pictured here in green. That's the boundaries of the 1855 Reservation Treaty. As I mentioned, there were several different bands. The band led by Chief Joseph lived in the Wallowa Valley, which is in northeastern Oregon, right there. However, about 5 years after this treaty was signed, gold was discovered. And guess what happened? People came pouring in. Now, under the treaty, it had been guaranteed by the U.S. government that no settlers would be allowed to come in to the area that was within the boundaries of this reservation, and yet here they come, setting up towns, trying to mine for gold, and so forth. Pressure started to be put on the Nez Perce to sign away more of their land, but they resisted doing that, except for one group who did sign away their land, and as often was the case, the government decided to accept that on behalf of all Nez Perce people. So the government said that that applied to everybody, even though the vast majority of Nez Perce people and leaders had nothing to do with this treaty. The new treaty set up a much, much smaller reservation inside the boundary of the old one. This was done in 1869, and that reservation can be seen inside the green area in brown. Well, the majority of the Nez Perce people ignored this and continued to live in the areas where their particular bands had lived before. Finally, the government started pressuring them to give up their lands and all move into that tiny area. Again, they were resisting. Chief Joseph, Whitebird, Looking Glass, many other leaders resisted the idea of doing this. However, as tensions rose and the ever encroaching, ever more crowded white settlers were pushing against the Indians, who then, of course, were pushing back. There had been several incidents in the early 1870s. There had been people killed on both sides. And as they're awaiting a meeting with General Oliver O. Howard, who was in charge of the U.S. Army in this region, as they were awaiting this meeting, and in fact, even considering possibly moving on to the reservation, several young men who had been stirred up they'd been stirred up by one of their elders, a guy named Red Grizzly Bear, who was taunting some of the young men whose relatives had been killed by white people and who had done nothing about it. So they went out and did something about it and killed 3 or 4 white people. Then, when they came back with news of that, several of the other young men went off and started raiding as well. Once this happened, Chief Joseph and the other Nez Perce leaders realized they were not going to be allowed to stay where they were from. They were going to be forced onto this reservation. And in fact, General Howard had made clear his intention to send out soldiers to punish the Nez Perce people for the raids. So even if they agree to come into the reservation, soldiers are going to come in and start attacking them. Therefore, Chief Joseph and the others decided, if we're going to move, then we can at least go where we decide to go. So in June 1877, the majority of the Nez Perce people packed up and headed east toward Montana. Actually, they were heading toward the Montana-Wyoming border and the Yellowstone country. By the way, Yellowstone had just become the site of a national park, which was a relatively new thing at that time. So that may seem like a strange choice. Why did they head for Yellowstone National Park? Fact is, they were very familiar with that area. That was sort of like the easternmost edge of their radius of influence. And for probably generations, they had traveled to the Yellowstone area to hunt at certain times of the year. And they had a good relationship with the Shoshone Indians and the Crow Indians of that area. So their goal was to head to sort of like their vacation spot, I guess you might say, but to head to that spot in hopes that they could get shelter and assistance from their allies, the Crow people. When they finally got there in August, the Crow were not that open to wanting to be helpful. So instead, they afterward headed due north for the Canadian border, where their plan was to join up with Sitting Bull. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds, that whole trip, because as soon as they left, Brigadier General O. Howard set off in pursuit of them. There were probably close to 3,000 Nez Perce making this journey, out of whom there were about 600 warriors. Over a thousand troops came after them, commanded by Howard, and it was a running battle. In fact, over the course of their 1,200-mile trek, they engaged with the U.S. Army on 18 separate occasions, most of those minor skirmishes, 2 of them major battles. When they had reached the Yellowstone and then started heading north, the troops that they had to deal with doubled, because then they had to deal with Brigadier General Nelson Miles, who had gotten promoted. He had his 1 star now, just like General Howard. And in fact, Miles was located out of, you'll see all the way to the right, Fort Keogh. That's the area where he had made that encampment on the Tongue River when he was leading the fight against the Lakota and Cheyenne. And then they had built a fort about a year before this. Actually, maybe not that long before. Anyway, they had built a fort, and it was named for Miles Keogh, the Irish-born captain who had died with Custer. Anyway, it was a long, hard, difficult journey. A lot of the Nez Perce people died along the way of sickness and exposure, and a lot of them died from the fighting. In fact, altogether, there were probably about 1,000, probably about 1/3 of the Nez Perce people on this journey died before they reached the end. And there were about 300 U.S. soldiers who died during this war. Now, you may be asking yourself, why on earth would the Army be chasing them if the whole idea was to get them out of that very desirable Oregon and Washington country so that the U.S. could have it? And if these Indians are now basically offering to take themselves out of the picture and go to Canada and be somebody else's problem, why wouldn't the U.S. just let them do that? Well, part of the reason is at first they didn't know that's what they were doing, because that wasn't really their initial plan. But a big part of the reason is that it would set a very bad precedent from the perspective of the U.S. government to allow Indians to make decisions and do what they wanted instead of what the government told them. So that couldn't be allowed to stand, because next thing you know, other Native American tribes might also be deciding to disobey government orders. Well, this long, hard fight came to a conclusion at the base of Bear Paw Mountain in Montana, which was only 40 miles away from the Canadian border. But they were surrounded. The fighting had been very heavy. Whitebird, I think his band managed to make it across and joined up with Sitting Bull, but the rest of them surrendered. And Chief Joseph, when he came out to meet with Brigadier Generals Howard and Miles, gave a speech in his native language that was translated, and which then was printed in newspapers and really grabbed the imagination of the American people, and in fact is still considered one of the great American speeches. In addition, a lot of people around the country had been following news of this odyssey since it had started 4 months earlier, and a lot of people had sympathy for the plight of Chief Joseph and the other Nez Perce Indians, and people were kind of they were kind of sad for what was happening to them. So here is part of that speech as presented by an actor in a movie called I Will Fight No More Forever. But it is word for word the speech that Joseph gave.
I know your heart, General Howard. What you have said before, I have it in my heart. I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are dead. He who led the young men, my brother, Olcott, is dead. It is the young men who say yes or no. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them have run away into the hills. and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are. Perhaps they are freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs! I'm tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever.
General Miles had employed Lakota and Cheyenne scouts in his war against the Nez Perce, many of whom had been fighting against Miles the year before. And if you will recall, it was when the call came out around August for these scouts, and Crazy Horse was specifically asked to go and refused to do so. That's kind of what started the chain of events that led to his arrest and killing. It also makes you think that probably the situation with the Crow is that having been employed as scouts by the U.S. Army in the war against the Lakota and Cheyenne, and having developed a pretty good relationship with the U.S. Army and the U.S. government, they really were afraid to go out on a limb and rock the boat for the Nez Perce when they had the entire U.S. Army on their trail, basically.